The apostles asked Jesus what ought to be thought of the Jewish prophets who were believed to have proclaimed his coming beforehand. The master was angry that they still held such thoughts. He answered, Thou hast rejected the living one who is before thee, and spoken idly about the dead. This is an interesting Agrapha, because, well, at the time that these were being compiled in the early 20th century, late 19th century, from the documents that I was choosing, there were fragments that had been found at Oxyrhynchus, which is in Egypt, that turned out to be fragments of the Gospel of Thomas. Now, I deliberately left those out of the Agrapha that I chose to make this particular compilation, mainly because I wanted to be able to differentiate between the earlier versions of these sayings and the ones that we came to later have in our possession. For example, there is a parallel, pretty much the exact saying in the Gospel of Thomas that was found in 1945. So, what we had from this earlier time, from these earlier accounts, this one by Augustine, for example, we can judge just how accurate he was because we have a proof text. Here was what we had before, and here is what we had afterwards in the Gospel of Thomas. So we can kind of judge between the two. Now, the idea here is that Augustine is getting to this particular quote right here. And so this isn't really supposed to be um, the quote up here, it's just kind of a lead in. So it sort of paraphrases the first part of saying 52. So, in other words, when he says the apostles asked Jesus what ought to be thought of the Jewish prophets who were believed to have proclaimed his coming beforehand, all right, that's a paraphrase of 24 prophets have spoken in Israel, and they all spoke of you. Instead of saying the 24 prophets, which is an interesting thing to say, because that is one of the very few examples of the canon being mentioned, like the actual 24 prophets that exist within the Jewish canon. Um, Augustine seems to kind of gloss over that. Now, whether that's intentional or not, a little bit hard to say. I'll kind of give him a pass. He spoke of the Jewish prophets, which, if you kind of squint, then you could maybe read that as the accepted prophets or the prophets that were accepted by the Jews, and that might be sort of a paraphrase of the 24 prophets. But at least in Thomas, we have a very specific question to what Augustine is trying to paraphrase here. Then he kind of gives his opinion about what it means that he's angry about their thoughts, which kind of makes sense because here where it says, Thou hast rejected the living one who was before thee and spoken idly about the dead, it's hard to imagine that as being anything but anger. Obviously he's not happy about the fact that they've rejected him or ignored him or whatever. But when it comes to the saying itself, which is what I was trying to get to, is it's pretty much spot on. So this was what he was trying to get right, what he was trying to get with some reasonable amount of exactitude, which was, Thou hast rejected the living one who is before thee, which is pretty much spot on. You've ignored the living one right in front of you and spoken idly about the dead, and you've talked about those who are dead. So this kind of goes to show that at least in this particular instance, but probably as a general rule, that the agrapha that we are faced with are pretty close to the actual words themselves. There seems to be some attempt to get it right. Even when they're paraphrasing, there's very little substantive difference between what it says over here and what it says over there. So even if they're paraphrasing, they're being basically faithful to some very core component, which is interesting to see. So the idea is, well, what does this mean? What can we make of this? Now, we know specifically where this comes from now. It comes from the Gospel of Thomas. There seems to have been some question in his mind, and he's very nonspecific here because he says, what wonder when the heretics invented such things about the prophets, for this word belongs to some apocryphal writing. Um, So he's not even really specific about which writing this came from. So it might be Thomas, but in any case, this just goes to show this particular part of the saying matches this exactly, and we know that that's from the Gospel of Thomas. So if you're reading between the lines, what they're basically saying is that the 24 prophets are enough. That they all spoke of him, they spoke in Israel, that's cool, that's that is enough, that they did their job, that they were right, and we believe that. Now Jesus rebukes them. He says, you've ignored the living one in front of you and talked about those who are dead. Now, again, the prophets are dead. I mean, that's true in the literal sense. I mean, Jeremiah wasn't still walking around. Although at the Transfiguration, we did see Moses and Elijah, so they're timeless in a way. I mean, they're not really dead dead. They have an exalted state that they're living in where they can travel across time and physically be with Jesus and the apostles. So they're clearly living. And so that's a critical difference. I mean, the prophets in their true state are alive and they are eternal. So what does he mean by dead? Um, you really got to look at what Thomas, for example, means by death. He says, whoever discovers the meaning of these sayings will not taste death. Now, we sort of have the converse of that saying here in the Clementine homilies, where it says, Jesus said, I am he concerning whom Moses prophesied, saying, a prophet shall the Lord our God raise unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Hear him in all things, and whoever will not hear that prophet shall die. So the death is a spiritual death. The death is in not hearing. And it's a willful, again, this is a willful not hearing. This is willful ignorance on the part of people. So we have whoever discovers the meanings of these sayings won't taste death. In other words, they will come alive. And those who refuse to hear that prophet, which is Jesus, of course, shall die. So that explains the message to Jezebel that her children will be killed with death. I mean, that is a spiritual death. So the idea here between what is living and what is dead, what is alive and what is dead, the people who believed in the 24 prophets, let's say, believed in the canon. All right. So the people were relying on Jewish traditions or the Jewish idea of what the 24 prophets were. But Jesus is the living one who is right in front of them. Remember, he's the one who's raising the dead. He's healing the blind. He's, giving, hearing back to the deaf and the ability to speak to the mute. Now, this is the Logos doing all of this. Again, you kind of have to put the word spiritual in front of everything to kind of understand that there's a physical and there's a spiritual dimension. When you think about a death, you're not just thinking about a physical death. You're thinking about a spiritual death. When you're talking about food, you're not just talking about something you put in your mouth, literally. You're talking about spiritual food. When you talk about blindness, because the idea is that there's a physical dimension to everything and a spiritual dimension to everything. The idea is that the 24 prophets is a limited thought. The prophets that the Jews accepted, who, even though they proclaimed his coming beforehand. In other words, the argument could be made that the 24 prophets have covered this material adequately. They all prophesied about you, and therefore this is adequate, right? And the master, if you will, Jesus says to them, look, I'm right in front of you, and you're talking about those who are dead. You're speaking idly about the dead. Who are the dead? The dead, again, are the people who don't know the mystery. They don't understand the truth. And it goes on in several other places throughout Thomas to explain the difference between the living and the dead. So let's move on. It says in Hippolytus, in the Refutation of All Heresies, Jesus says, if ye, eating that which was dead, have made it alive, what shall you do if you were to eat what was alive? So again, what is our spiritual food? Our spiritual food is the scriptures. Jesus is himself the Logos. Jesus is himself the living word. So again, if you're eating the dead scriptures, that is to say, if you're stuck on this idea of the 24, the idea that you're stuck on the idea of the canon, right? That you're eating what is dead because you're not allowed to see beyond that. I mean, like, even when you go and you look in the cross references, for example, in your Bible, most Bibles only cross reference within the Bible. So there's no ability to see beyond it. So even when you go to an overt example, like again, you go to Jude 14 and 15. If you read in the footnotes, most footnotes, I'm not saying all, but most footnotes will not lead you back to the book of Enoch. There are some scholarly ones, there are some study Bibles that do, but even the ones that do pretty much tell you that it's a non-canonical book, or that it's wasn't accepted by the prophets or whatever. They bias it. So again, they're dead because they can't transcend themselves, and therefore they are dead. Once you see that the word itself sort of transcends all that, again, when he's saying that he's alive and he's rebuking them for their belief in the canon and the belief of the 24 prophets alone as being adequate, he's basically saying you need to transcend that. You need to break out of that paradigm of the 24. Because again, they don't know the mystery. They haven't discovered the meanings of these sayings, and therefore they taste of death. That's a spiritual death. Again, if you don't hear him, in other words, if you ignore the one who is right in front of you, you're also going to die the spiritual death. And there's some other supporting statements here, like for example in Thomas 11. As an example, Jesus said, "This heaven will disappear, and the one above it will disappear too." Those who are dead aren't alive, and those who are living won't die. Uh, and again, that's sort of like the parallel here. That if you are dead, in other words, if you believe in the 24 books alone and you refuse to look outside, like, I mean, there's so many like examples of this in the scriptures. References to books outside of the Bible, books outside of the canon. There are all kinds of allusions. Some of them even name the books. I mean, if you read through the Old Testament, what is the book of Edo, and the book of Jasher, and other books that are referenced. It's clearly referencing things that are outside of themselves, outside of the canon. So the idea of the 24 as representative of the canon of the Jews, basically is an erroneous idea, and it's keeping them, if you will, dead. It's keeping them from seeing the living nature of the scriptures, the thing that allows them to wake up and see beyond it. And again, those who are living won't die. And who are the living? Those who discover the meaning of the sayings of this book, for example. They won't die. And who will die? Again, those who don't hear, those who refuse to hear. So in the days when you ate what was dead, what is the spiritual food? That's the scriptures. And how was it dead? Because it was a closed system. You saw it as purely something in and of itself, like the 24 prophets, something that's kind of open and shut, a closed canon. And you made it alive. How did you make it alive? In other words, by not ignoring the one who was before him, by not ignoring the actual nature of the logos, you got to see beyond the 24. You got to see beyond the canon, and therefore the scriptures came alive for you. And so now you are able to eat, if you will, of that which is alive. It says, when you are in the light, in other words, when you are enlightened, in other words, when you discover the meaning of these words, you don't taste of death, in other words, what will you do? When you come to this knowledge, what are you going to do? On the day that you were one, you became divided. So this is a prophecy about what's going to happen to the mystery. They had this unitary knowledge. They had this oneness of thought. They had this holistic idea of what the truth was. But they became divided when they went back to the idea of the canon, right? So when you become divided, what will you do, right? Well, again, the mystery is lost when you become divided, and the spiritual gives way to the physical. And that's sort of underscored by another saying in Gospel Thomas 59, where it says, "Look for the living one while you're still alive. If you die and then try to look for him, you won't be able to. You're not going to be able to find him once you fall into that trap of the canonical thought, where you have a closed system, because the books in the Bible point to books outside of themselves, and keeping them enclosed in a canon is going to basically lead to spiritual death.